up process for any of your quilt blocks, and actually making sure your quilt blocks are square and true to size is really important whenever you're constructing any quilt top that you're working with. So that's definitely a necessary step that you want to work with, and because you want to make sure that your quilt top is flat and not saggy and things like that. So I'm going to teach you all the tips and tricks of squaring up your quilt blocks. So there are 26 quilt blocks for the Live Well, Live Strong quilt, and I'm going to give you some tips on just a few of them, and then hopefully you can apply those tips to all the other quilt blocks that are part of the sampler quilt block of the Live Well, Live Strong quilt. So you can get the Live Well, Live Strong quilt if you want to make this pattern at stitchesquilting.com, and you can find all the information about that. It makes into the standard one, which is right behind me. It also goes into Twin, King, Queen, and Full, and we've got some new color versions for you guys, and I'm so excited to show you that, and also a bed runner version. And we've also been working on the foundation paper piecing version. So this is the one that's 20 by 20 inches. So you've got an incredible amount of options with the quilt pattern itself. And it is definitely a skill building quilt and a neat community, and I sure adore every single one of you guys and everything that we get to make together and do together. So let me know where you're from. I'm Deanna from Stitches Quilting in Salt Lake City, Utah. So, and I come on live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at noon. Okay, so these are the 26 quilt blocks that are the standard size. Hi Liz, it's so good to see you. I don't know if Linda's there. I wonder who else we've got online. But this is the 26 quilt blocks that we have made for the Live Well, Live Strong quilt. We have also on this sew along made 26 of the foundation paper piecing. So I actually keep my foundation paper piecing quilt blocks, which are small, and which is really fun because it's fun to piece tiny. And we've been definitely on a foundation paper piecing journey as we've done this sew along together. But you can see I keep all of mine in a container like that. So these are my 26 quilt blocks for the foundation paper piecing. There really isn't too much that you need to square up on these, but I'll show you. Hi, Linda. It's good to see you. Hi, Sharon. Hi, Margaret. Hello, Charmaine. It's so good to see every single one of you guys. I just absolutely adore you all. So these are my 26 for the foundation paper piecing. So we have made some progress, haven't we? We've made this progress together, and hopefully we've grown together and all those things. Oh, here's a little straggler as I pulled those out, but I go ahead and I put that back into my little zipper pouch, which helps me out a lot. Okay, so I am going to, and I have started sewing my quilt top together. I'm doing the standard version, but I'm also going to show you how to do the negative space version, and I'm going to show you how to do a bunch of different ways of piecing together this, and I'm also going to teach you how to piece together the Live Well, Live Strong quilt blocks that are foundation paper piece. So remember, we've kept all the paper on these quilt blocks. They're pretty precisely done when you've done it with the foundation paper piecing, so you don't have to square up too much. You need to get rid of extra threads that might be laying around on those. Okay, so I've started sewing together the different sections, or just this one section, and we're going to go over that today. And I'm going to show you how to square up a couple of the blocks, keeping in mind you need to stay true to your 1/4 inch seam allowances on the exterior sides of the quilt block. So when you square up the fuel quilt block, which is just 2 half square triangles, it's really simple. But when you square up something like a leisure quilt block, which is this pinwheel, you have to make sure that you are squaring that up so it takes into account these 1/4 inch seams. Once again, something like the Mindful quilt block, this hourglass, you don't have to worry about it as much, but there are certain quilt blocks that you have that anytime that you're making a quilt where you need to be attuned when you're squaring up your quilt block. Okay, so that's what we're going to go ahead and do today. So for example, positive wouldn't really be a problem. Freedom is definitely a quilt block that you want to be careful when you're squaring this up. And each one of the pages of the pattern tells you, you know, for this was the strength quilt block, it says square up this quilt block 30.5 inches. So every page of the quilt pattern does tell you, and any quilt pattern that you're working with will tell you what size to square up your quilt block. So this says press and trim each unit piece before piecing all 9 units together, and then it says press and square quilt block to 30.5 inches. Okay, so that's with the seam allowances in there. When this quilt block is finished, it's a 30-inch block. So anyways, it's pretty interesting, you know what I mean? Anyways, so this quilt block right here, when you're squaring it up, you never want to eliminate your seam allowance right here, the 1/4 inch seam there, the 1/4 inch seam here, or this 1/4 inch seam up at the top. So you really want to keep those in mind. So let's go ahead. I'm going to move these to the side, and I'm going to switch the camera to my overhead camera. So you can see I've got all of these laying around, and I'm going to set these over here to the side. I'm actually going to grab this quilt block right here, and I'm going to use my square ruler. So you could use any square ruler that you have. I find it's easier for me to sometimes use a square ruler. I do have different size of square rulers. So for this one, I do have a 6.5 inch ruler, but we're going to just go with this one right here for right now. So I'm going to lay this down right here, and I can see, and it's smart to lay your quilt block on here too. So when I lay this quilt block on here, I can see that I've got my 6.5 inches easily this way, and I've got my 6.5 inches over here too. Now, I might be a little shy right here and right here. I'm just a little shy on one of these sides, which means I might have grabbed a little bit too much fabric as I was piecing this together. But I feel good about my 1/4 inch seams. So we are going to actually attach this quilt block to this section over here, and I'm going to show you how we're going to match that. And then we're going to keep in mind when we're piecing this that, you know, this one might be a little shy or a little short in one little area right there. I can block this quilt block, and I can do a tutorial on how to block a quilt block. What you would do is, in order to block a quilt block, you would have a spray bottle of water or starch. You would go ahead and measure this out and completely get a good measurement on a surface that can absorb what you're doing. And then when I am steaming this with my iron, I would go ahead and give a little bit of a pull here, and I would pull this until it blocked out to that 6.5 inches. I could easily do this, but this is just a tiny little hair off, so I'm not really worried about this one right here. Okay, but that's the general idea of how to block a quilt block if it's actually just slightly too small. Okay, so there's a quick little tip there. So let's go back to our making sure those seam allowances match. Now this one and this one we're going to sew to this row today, and I'm going to teach you how to match those seams, but I went ahead and I selected these two quilt blocks right here that we are going to make sure are squared up. This is the Choices quilt block, and you can see you've got a lot of different points coming over here that you're going to want to make sure that you're matching when you're sewing it to the next quilt block. So we want to make sure we've got our 1/4 inch seams here, so that when this quilt block is sewn to the one next to it, it will match. Once again, we've got 1/4 inch seam allowances here, where we need to make sure that these 1/4 inch seam allowances are just perfectly lined up as we are trimming our block. We do not want to cut off this 1/4 inch seam allowance. We need this 1/4 inch seam allowance to match up to the next block. So that's one of the great things about the Live Well, Live Strong quilt, is that we're matching exterior 1/4 inch seam allowances to other exterior 1/4 inch seam allowances. And that makes for really working on matching those seams, okay? So when we would put these right sides together, then we're going to want to make sure we match all of those seams up. Okay, so let's go ahead and square this. Before I square it, I'm going to make sure I have a good press on my quilt block. I don't want to mutate it, okay? We're just pressing, okay? We're not ironing, we're just doing a press. We don't want to iron it so much that we're shifting our fabrics to the point that they're getting mutated. But look at this quilt block. This quilt block is pretty much all triangles, other than 4 squares in the center. So it's easy for these triangles to get slightly stretched the wrong way. Okay, so this is nice and pressed. We're now going to lay this quilt block, because you can see I still have my dog ears hanging out here, and I have my dog ears here. So we're going to want to trim off some of these edges. So let's look and see what we're measuring at. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and lay this. Let me make sure. I think you can see this entire little bit. Let me push those other quilt blocks right there. That's a little bit shadowed. Let me bring this over one more. Okay, so we have this. I'm going to go ahead and, I'm sorry, but I always lay my quilt block kind of in the center of my mat, and I don't do it just right next to the corner. And I don't know, maybe that's because I'm filming and I'm in a habit of doing that. I'm not sure. So I count out my squares. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. We need this to be a 12.5 inch square. So that's just what I do, because I don't want to be down here where I'm rethinking my math. I guess sometimes I don't want to make a mistake with my quilt block. Okay, so we've got 12.5 inches. I'm doing a square line over here and a square line right up here. So let's see if that's working. This is coming down to my 1/2 inch mark. So I need this to just kind of come a little bit closer. Let's go ahead and look at this. And so so this is how you're going to get a nice flat quilt. Let's bring over just my ruler, and I'm going to clean up this edge right here. I'm going to stay true to everything along here, but I'm going to clean off this edge with these dog ears hanging out. So let's just carefully clean off that edge. All right. And we could block this square. Once again, I'm going to clean off this edge right here. I'm really not cutting off any fabric. I'm not really cutting off any fabric at all, except for really my dog ears, okay, at this moment in time. So I'm just I have just that little bit of debris right there. Okay, let's look at this next side, and I'll show you what I'm doing. So I'm just kind of doing a slight clean off. And as I'm doing this, I am checking that 1/4 inch seam. So let me go ahead and show you. So let's pivot right here. And we're going to come right over here. I'm going to square this up. And when I lay my ruler right here, I want to see that there is a 1/4 inch seam between these exterior seam allowance and this interior part right here. So I'm laying this down, and I want to see that a true 1/4 inch seam, or just maybe a tiny bit larger, okay? I don't want, I've been able to kind of see most of these are good. Right here, I've got a narrow 1/4 inch seam here compared to this one right here, okay? So, and these are the things that we want to keep in mind as we are making our blocks, is you have to stay true to keeping those 1/4 inch seams. So let's go ahead and look at this now. Let's lay this back out, and let's see how we're doing. We've definitely got, I'm just a little short right in here. I'm just slightly short. So if I really, really wanted to, I could actually take these 2 pieces and just bring them down slightly if I wanted to unpick the block. I might have gone a little bit large. You can see here on my seaming, I always am piecing these blocks during live videos. So you can see, look, I went a little wonky there, and I try to go fast for you guys too. So yeah, so there's just things to look at, and I could also go and block this so it's just slightly bigger. But I know I'm going to be able to compensate for this. So I've got my eyes on that. You just do not slice off this one side. Okay, let's go ahead and look at the choices quilt block. Okay, so we're squaring this up. We need that 12.5 inches square. I've already trimmed off this, and I have squared this one up. So, but you can see I've got good 1/4 inch seams along here. This one I allowed to be a little bit wider of a 1/4 inch seam in order to stay true to the size of the quilt block that was needed. So I'm just slightly off just right there, okay? But otherwise, I've got a 12.5 inch block, and I'm looking great right there. Okay, let's go back. So that's just looking at some of your quilt blocks there and putting those together. So you just want to kind of make sure they are as squared up as possibly. Remember, quilting is not perfect. Now, this very first section A consists of our very beginning quilt blocks. We've got fuel, the pinwheel for leisure, we've got the mindful quilt block right there. Then right after that, we have got the positive quilt block, because remember, this is all about health and wellness. Hi, Lynette. How are you guys? Hi, Liz. Hi, Belle. It's so good to see you guys. We've got the positive quilt block that we're going to stitch right here. And then we have got the freedom quilt block. And right here, we're going to really want to make sure we're matching that 1/4 inch seam. And then, of course, we're going to sew on the self-care blow quilt block. This is, bow tie quilt block. This is freedom because it's flying geese. So let's go ahead and put these right sides together. I'm going to put this right sides together here. I already have these ones sewn. And we're going to just do this real quickly. But those are some tips on squaring up your quilt blocks. Can you guys think of any tips or tricks that you would recommend for squaring up your quilt blocks, and if necessary, how you can block a quilt block? So maybe I'll do, in the next video, I'll do a sample of how to block your quilt block. So let's go ahead and sew a 1/4 inch seam here. And we do want to have true 1/4 inch seams for this quilt. So some quilts might say, put together the quilt with a scant 1/4 inch seam. Okay, so different quilts have different instructions. So it's good to read the pattern instructions. Okay, so this section has 6 blocks. We're now going to sew the freedom to the positive quilt block. So, and this is where we absolutely want to make sure that we're matching this 1/4 inch seam. So let's go ahead and pin this. I have on the freedom quilt block, this flying geese freedom quilt block, I am wanting to make sure, and I'm making sure this matches from side to side. You can see there. And if I need to, hopefully they're all true to form, but if I need to, cotton does have a little bit of a stretch to it. And if it's just slight, you can have that match. All right, when we are sewing along this right here, we are going to want to intersect between this stitch line right here and this horizontal stitch line. So this is a 45-degree angle and the horizontal. We are wanting to just go on the right side of piecing these together. And when you're piecing these blocks, make sure you're always matching your exterior point lines. So let's go ahead and put this under for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm going to make sure, whether it's 1/4 inch or not, I'm going to make sure that point is being intersected right where those seams are, or just slightly to a hair over to the right side. So let's go ahead and test this and see if that seam is matching. Okay, so let's open this up and look at how that matched. So we've got the entire point right there, which is fine. Let's go ahead and press this real fast. We always want to press as we go. I always love pressing. I've got to trim some extra threads on here. But you can see now I've got this 1/4 inch seam here, but I've also set up this 1/4 inch seam, so it's going to work for the next time. So you can see right here, as I lay my ruler over, I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance that's ready to be stitched for this row to the section below it. And I've got my 1/4 inch seam allowance right up here when I stitch together the row up above. Okay, so you can see how that matches just beautifully. Once again, I'm going to take the self-care block, sew it to the freedom quilt block, And you can see I've got a little bit of an extra thread right there where I trimmed off a little bit too much. Just leave that as is. If you're just slightly off and a little thin on here, you're better off matching your seams and having slightly thinner of a 1/4 of an inch seam and accommodating this, okay? So I'm going to show you how I'm going to match this up. I'm going to just match that up right like that. I've got this extra, and these are the kinds of things that you just have to accommodate. You're sewing together fabric, and it isn't always perfect, but that's a good match, okay? So let's go ahead and match this together. And this is the self-care block to the freedom quilt block. Now, I have pinned this side. I never put my pins into my 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I am absolutely going to sew on this stitch line and this side because I need to match that 1/4 of an inch seam right here. So I'm going to look for this when I'm stitching over it. I want to just be one hair over to the right of that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And you will have such beautiful matching exterior points, and you will have a nice flat quilt. You really will. So let's go ahead and stitch this down. We'll check out the points, and then I am going to come back. I am showing you how to piece this together for the classic Live Well, Live Strong quilt that is 60 by 60 inches. But it's really important to learn how to match those exterior seam allowances. There are additional layouts. Okay, look at how perfect that looks. And this is not meant to necessarily match this. I could have. Maybe I should go back and fix that. But I don't see that matching on my original quilts, which is interesting there. So anyways, but it looks beautiful, doesn't it? It looks absolutely beautiful. So that is section A of the quilt. Okay, let's go ahead. So this is section A. I gave you a good little review of how to square up your quilt blocks, of how to match your 1/4 inch seam allowances as you are sewing your quilt blocks together, and when you're squaring them up to make sure you're taking into account those 1/4 inch seam allowances. The one where we saw the very most was on this leisure quilt block, where we have to accommodate all of these different points and then have them look like points on the front side. So do what you can, and remember, if you need to go a little bit of a hair lighter in there, you can see I still have a very firm stitch right there. This is just a little bit thinner than a 1/4 of an inch seam, but go ahead and stitch those together so they do match. So anyways, I love you guys so much. It's so good to see you guys. I will be back on Wednesday. We will continue to sew together the different units, and I will also show you how to piece your foundation paper piecing papers together. So on Wednesday, we're going to go ahead and do section A of this one, and I'll go ahead and teach you how to do that with the foundation paper piecing intact, because you don't take out any of your paper before you sew it together. All right, I'll see you noon on Wednesday. Can't wait. It's going to be great, and I will chat with you guys on the next side. All right, have fun.